I had been working at Aldridge Consulting for 7 months when the firm won the contract to restructure the operations of a German pharmaceutical manufacturer expanding into the U.S. market, and the engagement was valued at $8.3 million over 18 months, making it one of the largest deals the firm had closed that year. The client was BioMedtech GmbH, a mid-sized company based in Stuttgart with annual revenue of approximately €640 million, and they needed help navigating FDA regulatory requirements, establishing U.S. distribution networks, and implementing compliance frameworks that would allow them to operate in a market that was significantly more complex than anything they had dealt with in Europe. I was assigned to the engagement as a senior analyst, one of 6 team members working under a partner named Douglas Whitmore, and from the first client kickoff meeting, it was clear that Douglas had no idea what he was doing but possessed absolute confidence that his ignorance would not matter because he had an MBA from Wharton and 20 years of consulting experience that he believed made him qualified to advise on anything. The client's leadership team included the CEO, Dr. Klaus Reinhardt, the CFO, Matthias Becker, and the head of regulatory affairs, Dr. Petra Hoffmann, and all 3 spoke English fluently but with pronounced German accents, the kind that certain Americans find amusing or use as an excuse to question someone's competence, and Douglas fell squarely into that category. The first sign of trouble came during the initial presentation when Douglas was walking through the proposed project timeline and Dr. Reinhardt asked a clarifying question about the sequencing of FDA submissions relative to facility inspections, and Douglas responded with a vague explanation that did not actually answer the question, then made a comment about how he appreciated the client's attention to detail even though English was clearly not their first language, phrasing it as though he were complimenting them, but delivering it in a tone that suggested he found their accents charming in a condescending way. Dr. Reinhardt's expression did not change, but I saw Dr. Hoffmann exchange a glance with Matthias, and I understood immediately that Douglas had just made the kind of cultural misstep that damages client relationships in ways that are difficult to repair. The meeting continued, and Douglas made 2 more similar comments over the next hour, each time framing the client's questions as though the language barrier was causing confusion rather than acknowledging that his answers were inadequate, and by the time we left the client's temporary U.S. offices, I knew this engagement was going to be a disaster unless someone intervened. I had grown up in Poland, moved to the United States at 16, and had worked deliberately to minimize my accent because I understood that in American professional settings, sounding foreign often meant being taken less seriously regardless of your actual competence. My English was fluent, grammatically precise, and carried only the faintest trace of my native language, noticeable primarily in how I pronounced certain consonants and in the slight formal quality of my phrasing. And I had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of being an immigrant in corporate America by being extraordinarily competent, never making mistakes that could be attributed to language barriers, and staying quiet until I had something valuable to contribute. But I also understood something that Douglas did not, which was that clients like BioMedtech who were expanding into a foreign market were not confused by complexity. They were operating in a second language while managing regulatory systems more intricate than anything their home market required, and they needed consultants who respected that difficulty rather than patronized them for it. After the kickoff meeting, I went back to my desk and started building a parallel work stream that Douglas did not know about, pulling FDA guidance documents, analyzing the specific regulatory pathways that would apply to BioMedtech's product portfolio, and creating detailed process maps that showed exactly how the approval timeline would interact with facility readiness, supply chain setup, and compliance verification. The humiliation came 3 weeks into the engagement during a working session at the client site where the consulting team was supposed to present our preliminary findings on the regulatory strategy. Douglas had assigned me to build the presentation deck, but he had not reviewed my work before the meeting, assuming that as a senior analyst I would simply execute his high-level direction without adding substantive analysis. What I had actually done was build a presentation that included specific regulatory pathways, risk assessments for each product category, and a detailed timeline showing the critical path dependencies that would determine whether BioMedtech could meet their target launch date. The presentation was technically sound, thoroughly researched, and directly addressed the questions Dr. Reinhardt had raised in the kickoff meeting that Douglas had failed to answer. But when Douglas opened the deck 5 minutes before the client meeting and saw the level of detail I had included, he became visibly irritated and told me that I had overcomplicated things, that clients did not need this much technical depth, and that I should have focused on high-level strategy rather than getting lost in regulatory minutiae. I did not argue, I simply noted his feedback and sat down in the conference room as the client team filed in. Douglas began the presentation by apologizing in advance for the excessive detail, explaining that one of his analysts had gotten a bit too deep into the technical weeds, and he made a joke about how consultants fresh out of graduate school sometimes had trouble seeing the forest for the trees. He delivered this with a smile as though he were sharing an inside observation with the client, and then he started clicking through my slides, summarizing them at a high level and skipping over the detailed analysis I had built. Dr. Hoffman stopped him on the third slide and asked him to go back to the regulatory pathway comparison I had created, and she asked a specific technical question about the 510K pre-market notification process versus the pre-market approval pathway for one of their Class III medical devices. Douglas attempted to answer with generalities about FDA requirements, and Dr. Hoffman cut him off and asked whether the analyst who had built the presentation was in the room. Douglas hesitated, clearly annoyed, and then gestured toward me and said that yes, I had done the technical research, though he cautioned that some of the details might be overly academic. Dr. Hoffman looked at me directly and repeated her question about the regulatory pathways. I answered in detail, explaining the differences between the two approval routes, the specific data requirements for each, the typical timeline ranges, and the strategic implications of choosing one pathway over the other based on their existing clinical evidence. Dr. Hoffman asked 3 follow-up questions. I answered all of them. Then Dr. Reinhardt asked me to walk through the entire critical path analysis I had built, and for the next 45 minutes I presented the material I had developed while Douglas sat silently at the head of the table, his face growing progressively more rigid as the client directed every question to me and ignored him entirely. After the meeting, Douglas pulled me into a side office and told me that I had overstepped, that my role was to support his client interactions rather than take over presentations, and that in the future I needed to defer to him when clients asked technical questions because it undermined his authority when junior team members positioned themselves as experts. He phrased this as constructive feedback about executive presence and client management, but the message was clear. I had embarrassed him by knowing more than he did, and he was not going to tolerate it happening again. I apologized for any confusion about roles and said I would be more mindful of staying in my lane going forward. Then I went back to the hotel, opened my laptop, and continued building the work that actually mattered. Over the next 3 months, the pattern repeated itself with increasing clarity. Douglas would hold internal team meetings where he outlined strategic recommendations based on his consulting experience and business school frameworks. I would quietly identify the technical gaps and regulatory risks in his proposals, and I would build supplementary analysis that addressed those gaps without directly contradicting him in front of the team. Then we would present to the client. Douglas would deliver his high-level strategy. The client would ask detailed technical questions that Douglas could not answer, and I would provide the answers while Douglas grew progressively more resentful of my presence on the engagement. The breaking point came when Biomedtech's regulatory strategy hit a critical decision point about how to structure their FDA submissions for a product line that included both Class II and Class III devices, and Douglas recommended a consolidated submission approach that he claimed would streamline the process and reduce approval timelines. I had reviewed the FDA guidance and knew his recommendation was not just suboptimal but potentially disastrous, because it would trigger a higher level of scrutiny and could result in delays that would push their market entry back by at least 18 months. But when I tried to raise concerns in the internal team meeting, Douglas dismissed them as overthinking and said the client needed bold recommendations rather than cautious incrementalism. He scheduled a presentation to walk the client through his consolidated submission strategy, and I knew that if Biomedtech followed his advice, they would waste millions of dollars and potentially jeopardize their entire U.S. market entry. So I did something I had never done before in my career. I went around my engagement leader and contacted the client directly. I sent an email to Dr. Hoffman, not copying Douglas or anyone else on the consulting team, with the subject line Alternative Regulatory Strategy for FDA Submission Sequencing. The email was formal, professional, and framed as supplementary analysis rather than a contradiction of Douglas's recommendation. I attached a detailed memo outlining why the consolidated approach would likely fail, citing specific FDA guidance documents, precedent cases from similar device submissions, and a risk-adjusted timeline comparison showing that a phased submission strategy would actually result in faster overall approval despite appearing more complex on the surface. I explained the technical reasoning in precise detail, acknowledged the strategic appeal of Douglas's streamlined approach, and provided regulatory language directly from FDA guidance that supported my alternative recommendation. Then, I included a final paragraph stating that I was sharing this analysis in my capacity as the technical lead on regulatory workstreams, that I had significant respect for the engagement partner's strategic judgment, and that I wanted to ensure the client had access to all relevant technical considerations before making a final decision. I sent the email at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and I received a response from Dr. Hoffman at 6 a.m. the next morning asking me to join a call with the client leadership team at 9. The call did not include Douglas. Dr. Reinhardt, Dr. Hoffman, and Matthias were on the line, and they asked me to walk through my alternative strategy in detail, explaining not just what I recommended but why I believed the consolidated approach would fail. I spent 90 minutes on that call answering technical questions, citing regulatory precedents, explaining the risk factors that Douglas had not considered, and providing implementation guidance for how they could execute the phased strategy I was proposing. At the end of the call, Dr. Reinhardt thanked me for the analysis and said they would be adopting my recommendation, and he asked whether I would be willing to serve as the primary point of contact for all regulatory workstreams going forward, reporting directly to Dr. Hoffman rather than working through the engagement partner. I said I would need to discuss the reporting structure with my firm's leadership, but that I was committed to ensuring the engagement's success. Dr. Reinhardt said he appreciated my professionalism, and then he added that the client had been increasingly concerned about the strategic direction they were receiving from Aldridge Consulting, and that my technical expertise had restored their confidence that the engagement could deliver value. The call ended, and I sat at my desk knowing that I had just detonated my relationship with Douglas and possibly my career at the firm, but also knowing that I had prevented a multi-million-dollar mistake that would have destroyed the client's market entry timeline. Douglas found out about the call within hours because Dr. Hoffman had sent a follow-up email to the full engagement team thanking me for the supplementary analysis and confirming that BioMedTech would be proceeding with the phased submission strategy. Douglas called me immediately and told me to come to his office, and when I arrived, he closed the door and told me that I had committed a fireable offense by going directly to the client without his approval, that I had undermined the engagement leadership structure, and that he would be recommending my removal from the project and potentially from the firm. He said I had displayed a fundamental lack of judgment and professional maturity, and that my technical skills did not compensate for my inability to work within appropriate boundaries. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I asked him a single question: did he believe his consolidated submission strategy was technically sound and in the client's best interest? He said that was not the point, that consulting was about managing client relationships and that second-guessing the engagement partner in front of the client was unacceptable regardless of the technical merits. I nodded, thanked him for his feedback, and left his office. Then, I sent an email to the managing partner of the firm's life sciences practice, a woman named Catherine Morrow who I had worked with on a previous engagement, requesting a meeting to discuss the BioMedTech situation. Catherine met with me the next day, and I walked her through everything: Douglas's dismissal of the client's technical questions, his recommendation of a regulatory strategy that contradicted FDA guidance, my decision to provide alternative analysis directly to the client, and the client's response requesting that I serve as the primary technical lead. I did not frame it as a complaint about Douglas, but as a situation that required senior leadership guidance on how to structure the engagement going forward given the client's explicit preference for my technical leadership. Catherine asked detailed questions about the regulatory strategy differences, reviewed the FDA guidance I had cited, and asked me to send her the full memo I had provided to Dr. Hoffman. Then she scheduled a call with Dr. Reinhardt to discuss the engagement structure. That call resulted in a formal restructuring where I was promoted to engagement manager and designated as the primary client contact for all technical workstreams, while Douglas retained the title of engagement partner but was effectively sidelined into a strategic advisory role with minimal client interaction. The firm's official communication described this as an evolution of engagement governance to better leverage specialized expertise, but everyone involved understood what had actually happened. The client had lost confidence in Douglas and had explicitly requested that I run the project. The engagement continued for another 14 months, and I worked directly with Dr. Hoffman's team to execute the phased regulatory strategy, coordinating FDA submissions, managing pre-submission meetings, troubleshooting compliance issues, and navigating the dozens of technical obstacles that arose during the approval process. BioMedTech received FDA clearance for their Class II devices 9 months ahead of Douglas's projected timeline, and their Class III device approval came through 3 months after that, allowing them to launch their full product portfolio in the U.S. market within the original 18-month window they had targeted when they hired Aldridge Consulting. The engagement generated $2.4 million in additional consulting fees beyond the original contract, because the client kept expanding the scope to include post-approval compliance support, distribution strategy, and market entry planning. And every additional workstream was structured as a direct engagement with me rather than going through the traditional partner-led model. Douglas remained nominally attached to the engagement for political reasons, attending quarterly steering committee meetings where he provided high-level strategic observations that the client politely acknowledged before turning to me for the actual implementation guidance they needed. The partnership election that year included my name on the ballot, nominated by Catherine and supported by 3 other managing partners who had watched the BioMedTech engagement unfold and understood that I had saved a major client relationship while establishing a new model for how the firm could serve technically complex accounts. Douglas opposed my partnership nomination, arguing that I lacked the executive presence and client relationship skills that defined successful consulting partners, and he pointed to my decision to go around him as evidence of poor judgment and inability to work within established firm structures. The partnership committee reviewed the BioMedTech engagement in detail, including client feedback surveys where Dr. Reinhardt had specifically noted that my technical expertise and direct communication style had been critical to the engagement's success, and where he had described Douglas as strategically oriented but lacking the technical depth required for regulatory engagements of this complexity. The partnership vote was 12 in favor, 4 opposed, and I became the youngest partner in the firm's life sciences practice at 32 years old. Douglas left Aldridge Consulting 6 months later, taking a role at a smaller boutique firm where he could be a senior partner without the scrutiny of a larger organization's performance management systems. I heard through the firm's informal networks that he had told people his departure was motivated by philosophical differences about the firm's direction, that he believed Aldridge was becoming too focused on technical execution and losing sight of the strategic advisory relationship that defined great consulting. I did not follow his career after that because it was not relevant to my work, and because the principle he represented, that executive presence and relationship management mattered more than technical competence, had been tested in a high-stakes client engagement and had failed decisively when confronted with actual complexity. BioMedTech became one of my anchor clients, leading to 3 additional pharmaceutical and medical device engagements, where clients specifically requested me by name because they wanted someone who understood regulatory systems deeply enough to prevent expensive mistakes rather than someone who could deliver confident presentations about strategic frameworks. I built a practice area around FDA regulatory strategy, hired a team of consultants with scientific and engineering backgrounds who understood that technical precision was not optional in life sciences work, and established a reputation in the industry as someone who could navigate the most complex regulatory challenges, because I had done the work myself rather than delegating it to junior staff while taking credit for their expertise. The accent that Douglas had commented on in that first client meeting, the slight formal quality of my English that marked me as a non-native speaker, never went away entirely, and I stopped trying to eliminate it because I realized it served a useful purpose in client interactions. It signaled immediately that I was comfortable operating across cultural and linguistic boundaries, that I understood what it meant to navigate complex systems in a language that was not my native one, and that I would not patronize clients who were doing exactly the same thing. The German pharmaceutical executives I worked with appreciated that I took their questions seriously rather than treating their accents as charming obstacles to communication. And they trusted me because I demonstrated through technical precision and regulatory knowledge that I understood their business challenges at a level that most American consultants never bothered to achieve. They laughed at my accent in that first meeting, or more accurately, Douglas used their accents as an excuse to avoid answering their questions with the technical depth they required, and in doing so he revealed that he valued his own comfort and authority more than the client's success. I became the only one the client trusted not because I had better social skills or more polished English, but because I did the work, understood the technical details that determined whether their market entry would succeed or fail, and had the professional courage to provide accurate guidance even when it contradicted my engagement leader's preferred narrative. The distance between being dismissed as an overcomplicated analyst and becoming a trusted partner was filled not with dramatic confrontations or public victories, but with quiet technical precision, direct communication, and the willingness to prioritize client outcomes over internal political safety. And that principle has defined every engagement I have led since.